Okay, so ImageLine just put out a new distortion plugin with the new update of FL Studio called Distructor. It's mainly a distortion plugin, but it also has a filter, a chorus, and a speaker. So it has 4 slots, and this allows you to have one of each, and you can have more than one of a certain kind. So say I want like a filter before distortion, and then one after, and then I'll have a speaker at the end. I can do that. It combines a lot of FL Studio's old features, including Fruity Blood Overdrive, Fastest, and Soft Clipper, as well as Harmer's distortion types. It only has a couple new things, besides the plugin itself, which is new. It's got 3 new distortion types, and it's also got a semi-new bit crusher from Fruity Delay 3. So really, there's not a lot of new stuff. A lot of this is taken from old plugins, so you may be thinking, what's the point? I can have, as I said, multiple types of plugins. So say I want a filter and then a distortion, like a blood overdrive and a fastest. I can do that, and it only takes up 1 slot, right? Whereas before, I would have had to use like 3 slots. And I could also have something extra, like I could fill up all 4 slots if I wanted. This only takes up 1 effect slot, and FL Studio can't have unlimited effect slots yet unless you're using Patcher. But if you're using just the mixer slots for your effects, then you gotta kind of make sure you don't run out of slots to use. So that's one advantage to using Distructor. It's going from left to right, and it only goes in serial. There's no parallel, so you can't have multiple effects running alongside each other. Again, if you use Patcher, you can override these kinds of setbacks, but I'm just doing it in the mixer track right now, which is what most people probably do. You can change the filter or distortion chorus speaker type up here. You can temporarily mute the effect with the coin slot next to the effect, and down below the plugin parameters you have a few global controls. In is the volume of the sound going into the effect before the effect is applied. Mix is the amount of effect that's going to be heard, and out is the volume after the effect is applied. And this is the same for all 4 effect types. At the bottom, you can change the order of the plugins by clicking these 2 arrows at the bottom, and you can remove a filter or distortion chorus speaker type by clicking remove and selecting yes. If you want to add another effect after you've gotten rid of it, you just go to the plus button at the empty slot and you pick your effect. So there's a few things to go over in the individual effects. Distortion, as I said, it's a mix of old and new. Blood Overdrive, Fastest, Soft Clipper, and Harmer's distortion types are all old. Crusher, FL Studio doesn't really have a dedicated bit crusher. It does have a couple hidden in certain plugins if you know where to look, but it's mostly old distortion types that are brought into this new plugin for you to use. The filter types are from FL Studio's other new plugin called Flex, and I'll be going over those as well. Chorus is based off of Fruity Delay 3, and Speaker is based off of Fruity Convolver. So these are all technically in old plugins, but you technically before you couldn't use Harmer's distortion types on sounds that weren't already in Harmer, unless you recorded out the sound and dragged it into Harmer to use, which is a tutorial for another time, I guess. So, starting with a few distortion effects, I'll go over these. Pre-band and color in Blood Overdrive. Basically what Blood Overdrive is, it makes it sound louder and it ends up distorting as a result. It's one of the most common types of distortion, just overdrive. I have a simple saw wave right now, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to change these parameters and you can see how the sound changes. So pre-band and color is basically a bandpass filter that's been sort of applied to the sound, and the color is like the frequency of the bandpass. Preamp is a pretty common parameter for distortion plugins. It's like the volume before the distortion is applied, and when you turn up the preamp, there's more distortion. If you turn up the preamp, usually you'd compensate by turning down the post gain, which is the volume afterwards, but then you also have the in and out knobs below. Post filter is like a little low pass filter after the distortion is applied, because when you distort something, you'll get a lot of high frequency stuff. So you can take out a little bit of the highest stuff if you want. And times 100 makes everything really loud. If I turn up preamp, if I have X100 on, the preamp has a much larger effect. Oversampling and center are common to a lot of these effects. So center will remove DC offset, which is like, you see the center line on Wave Candy. If the waveform is off center, it'll be like above or below. Its center will be not at the middle line, so center will bring it back to the center. And oversampling basically stops the noise that's above the Nyquist frequency from wrapping down into the spectrum and causing distortion. Basically, it gets rid of some noise at the top of your sound. So just a fair warning, it does take a bit of CPU sometimes. So that's blood overdrive. Fastest also has center and oversampling, but it's a little bit different. It has the preamp and the post gain as usual. The threshold basically lowers the maximum peaks in the wave, which also takes away a bit of distortion. And mix, two mix knobs, interesting. If you've used fastest, you'll see there are two types of distortion you can use. So this just switches the type, nothing too complicated. Soft clipper is extremely simple. If I just bring up soft clipper, it has like a little visual, so it's easy to see what it does. Threshold just brings down the peaks of the wave, and post is the post gain, which brings up the volume after your sound is distorted. It's like a simple volume knob. A lot of these knobs are redundant. That's fine, not a big deal. So Harmer's distortion types all have the exact same parameters, and the main difference is basically how harsh the sound is after the distortion. Bit crush and bit jam are a bit different. They're like bit crushing. They sound a little bit like pulse width modulation or quantization distortion. That's bit crush. Bit jam is a little bit different. Just let me turn that down. Okay. With Wave Candy, it's really helpful to see what the waves do, or the distortion types. Classic, Hill, Flat Hat are all pretty tame. Flat Hat is like in the middle kind of. Cube, Log, and Rubber are definitely the harshest. Soft Sat is probably the softest. Then you have Ribbon, which is getting towards the more distorted side. Maybe that's too loud. Yeah. And Sign Crush, also kind of interesting. The asymmetry is like, it's kind of related to the center button. So if you move around the asymmetry, it'll change the stereo field kind of. It's a bit like the stereo separation knobs in the speaker plugin. Okay, so now we're on to the new distortion types. Wavefolder, you may have seen in other plugins before, but basically what wavefolding does is it, instead of just clipping the highest parts of the waveform, it'll mirror them back towards the center. And in this case, the wavefolder makes kind of a sync effect. So this is basically no distortion, but as I distort, it's gonna seem like the wave goes up in pitch. So that's pretty much what wavefolding does. Pretty simple. Crossover tends to affect how asymmetry behaves, and asymmetry, in this case, it has to do with the zero crossing or the center line of the waveform. And again, the center button is your friend. Aperture is, in the manual, it's called warping distortion, which it sounds just a little bit redundant to me, but whatever. You see the preamp knob is back again. It's the volume before the distortion. Crossover and asymmetry are back, and so is threshold, and the warp point seems to have something to do with the frequency spectrum. The mode toggle here, if you turn this on, it makes the effect a lot softer, which is probably better for if you just want a simple, like, last little extra bit of distortion on your sound. And the center oversampling buttons are back. Abrasive is noise modulation distortion, so it's pretty easy to see what it does. That fuzziness in the sound, that's the noise being brought in. Then you have a dry wet knob so you can fade in the noise to taste. You have a bandpass filter controlling the noise. And then you have a filter toggle and a volume after the distortion is applied once again. Crusher is a simple bit crush. It's brought over from Fruity Delay 3, so technically not new, but now it's finally got its own, you don't have to use a delay, and it can be heard in the original sound instead of the delayed sounds now. So it's a little bit like another one of Harmer's distortion types. I believe it was Sine Crush or Bit Crush. Pretty self-explanatory. It's good for those retro chip tune type sounds. So that's distortion. Filters are from Flex, which is FL Studio's other new plugin. You have a series of filters, and a lot of them have numbers after them, and the number signifies the slope. What the slope is how fast or how steep the cutoff is. So if you have a low value like 6, it's going to be rolled off very slowly past the cutoff point. If you have a steeper value, it'll be more pronounced. And most filters have resonance. These filters, I don't like them that much. So the reason for that is if you turn the resonance up too much, basically what happens is it generates a sine wave at the cutoff. And that happens. So that is why you are very careful with the resonance on these filters. Yeah, these filters are definitely not the best, but these other filters, which I'm about to show you, are a bit cooler. So you have the typical peak. This one is good to use before distortion because it can put an emphasis on a certain part in the frequency spectrum, and then if you distort it, creates interesting harmonics sometimes. So that's a common acid type sound. Comb filters. FL Studio now has comb filters. Something to note about these two combs, you have comb plus and comb minus. Comb minus, if you turn up the resonance, it'll leave a resonant tail after you release the sound, whereas comb plus does not. It's just more of a typical filter. Vowel is interesting. The resonance doesn't control the amount of filtering. It controls where, like how high or how low the sound is, I guess the formant. It's kind of like the cutoff. What the cutoff does is it changes the type of vowel filter, so it's a bit different, so keep an eye out for that. Phaser cutoff is back to normal, and what it does, the resonance controls the width of the poles. So if I turn up the resonance, the poles spread out. If I turn down the resonance, the poles are brought back in. You have 3 different types of phasers. They're all a bit different. So those can be kind of cool. Those are like the peak filter. I can use words so fucking well. Fuck me. Low shelf and high shelf are pretty standard. I'll just show you what they do in parametric EQ. This is a low shelf. It turns up the frequencies below the cutoff, and high shelf turns up or down the frequencies above the cutoff, so the high frequencies. Just remember, high shelf, high frequency, low shelf, low frequency. Pretty simple. And all pass. So all pass is a less common type of filter. What it does is it changes the phase of the sound at the cutoff point, and the resonance controls the amount of phase change. So if I just have resonance all the way down, there isn't really much of a change. But if they turn up the resonance, I'm starting to change the phase of the sound at the cutoff point, and it's changing the waveform. The sound doesn't sound too different, but this is good for making squishy kind of bass sounds, or just making a little bit of a messy phase profile for your sound. Something to keep in mind, I have gotten some use out of the all-pass filter sometimes. If you use Citrus has 3 filters, and you can use an all-pass filter in Citrus. So I have routed like 3 all-pass filters in series sometimes to get really squishy kind of bass sounds out of a saw wave. Something for you to try out. Alright, chorus is based off of Fruity Delay 3, as I said. You can hear it, it's really apparent when you turn up the feedback, because you have a little bit of a tail after you let go of the note. Speed and depth are pitch controls, so if I turn down delay all the way, the pitch is really changing, and I can change the speed of the phase change until it gets really messy, or I can keep it really tame, and the depth will control the amount, like the range of the pitch change. Blur is pretty self-explanatory. Changes, well, I guess it makes it blurry. And colors like the emphasis in the frequency spectrum, it's like a tilt EQ. So all the way down, only low frequencies, all the way up, mostly high frequencies. And the delay is the amount of delay of the delayed voices. Alright, we've come to the last thing in Distructor, and that is the speaker effect. I mentioned earlier, I think, that it's based off of Fruity Convolver, and what I mean by that is if you open up Fruity Convolver and open up the presets, you can see there are a bunch of types of guitar cabinets, like down at the near the bottom, IMP, cabinet model A through to T. So you can actually check them out for yourself and maybe play with them a bit more in Fruity Convolver. But if you want just something quick and easy, open up speaker, click the drop down menu, you'll have a bunch of different types of models to choose from. You don't really have much control over the sound besides the choice of timbre, which is in this drop down menu. Stereo separation only does anything if you had stereo information previously. So if I just have like a saw wave, and it's 100% separated, there isn't really any stereo information, just a little bit, but the saw wave is completely mono. All the way right will be completely mono, all the way to the left will be completely stereo. It doesn't create stereo information by itself. Obviously the choice of cabinet has a part in it. If you have a chorus effect going into the speaker, chorus will create stereo. Otherwise, you need some other kind of stereo effect to create stereo information, but sometimes you may not want that. So speaker is just a little bit of extra sort of little feature, you know? A little bit of a little speakers. And 2 little buttons at the bottom, soft clip output, because this is a distortion effect. Distortion can make things very fucking loud. So if you press soft clip output, it'll prevent it from going over 0 dB, which would otherwise result in hard clipping, which people tend to not like that much. If I turn an effect on and I have peak meters on, you'll see it shows the volume in these green or orange bars. If I like turn it up, it goes all the way up to way too high. But if I turn the effect off, obviously the effect won't do anything, but the peak meters will still play. If I turn off the peak meters, you just don't see how loud the effect is at that point in the series of effects, how loud the sound is. And that's Destructor. Hope this was a bit helpful. The manual wasn't too much of a help, so I mostly just experimented a bunch with just moving the knobs around and having Wave Candy open, seeing what the effects would do. I advise you to play around with it yourself. I think the aperture distortion type is something I'll be looking into a bit more for my sound design, because it seems interesting, but I can't really tell at this point what it does. Anyway, that was Destructor.